Hi there everyone, welcome to the second video for week number 6. In this video we are going to be discussing Spinoza's religious beliefs. And in particular we're going to be focusing on a couple of the shorter readings that I had you do, Pierre Veil, which was actually for last week, and this week Gotthold Lessing. And I'll just speak a little bit more about their biographies in a moment. But what is important for us is that these are kind of like two immediate responses in the 18th century to Spinoza's philosophical system. We've talked a little bit about Weil's conviction that Spinoza is an atheist, but now that we have covered a significant stretch of the ethics, I really want to zoom in on one proposition in particular and really focus and think about the theological consequences of this belief. So really we're going to focus on one proposition. We're not even going to go through the proofs of it very much, but instead we're going to focus on what are the implications of this belief and how might you begin to think about and characterize Spinoza's beliefs, right? And just to remind you, this was a very, very big deal. Many academics, sort of like professor types and so on, came out as Spinozists during the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were expelled. They were, like, anyone even resembling Spinoza was oftentimes harangued, occasionally thrown in prison or exiled. So it was a very big deal for a very long time. And it really has kind of a specter over European philosophy, but that's also been part of the fascination with Spinoza too, is that Spinoza is sort of caught up in this legacy and this tradition of Europeans trying to think about themselves and clarify their own beliefs, and it's hard not to look at Spinoza with at least a little bit of admiration, for like really kind of overturning the table on everything that was going on at the time. Okay, so to begin with the board at the top, we have Spinoza's religious beliefs. This is something we're going to talk about. I'm going to make it one of your prompts for the discussion forum. And students often really like this. This is something to really get into. People have very different beliefs or intuitions about what they think is right. So I'm very interested to hear what you all think. So, part 1, proposition 15. Spinoza says, and I quote, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can be conceived without God." So this is, in a way, a restatement of both Descartes and Spinoza's belief that God is the absolute substance, and the nature of substance is characterized by independence. And if there is genuine independence, Spinoza reasons there can only be one substance, that is God. And so everything in the universe is God or is a modification of God. One distinction that Spinoza makes in the reading that I didn't write out, I kind of wish I did, but there's not enough room on the board, is between natur naturata and natur naturans. And that just sounds like you said natur 4 times, right? But really what the distinction is trying to exemplify is nature naturing versus nature natured. What does that mean? Well, we can think about God as a kind of kinetic, dynamic process. You know, you can almost identify Spinoza's God with like the laws of nature, right? And so the way that the laws of nature operate on a given object is subject to change all the time, right? And so that's why the objects, as the individual modes, go through all these different changes, right? And so you can think about God insofar as God is a substance, God is this verb-like, kinetic, dynamic activity, as nature naturing, the verb form, or natur naturata. Whereas God also, you know, in being the cause of him, her, them, itself, right, is also an effect, right, of him, her, them, self. It's not like God is the cause and then creation is something independent of God. That's exactly what has just been denied here, right? Whatever is, including creation, including the modes, including all the finite stuff, is in God. So there's no strict cut, right, between all the finite stuff and all of the infinite stuff. They're like two faces of the same thing, the same process. There's the process dimension, and then there's the result dimension. Modes are just kind of the results of the activity of God. It's the way in which when God is a cause of him, her, them, self, right? That God is therefore also an effect of that same process, right? And so this Spinoza's distinction between natur naturata and natur naturans points out the way that all of the modes, all of the stuff that we think about as being finite and, you know, by being finite, being separated from God, Spinoza is very clear. Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. So without the absolute substance of the universe, there are no modifications. If there's not the kinetic dynamic process of God causing themselves, then there is not the effects. There's not creation. There's not all the modifications. There's not all of the bodies and ideas and so on, right? And so this is why there's a big debate over whether or not Spinoza is an atheist, right? A as in, you know, like amoral, you're not moral, atheist, you're not a theist, right? Or, as Lessing kind of characterizes it, especially gets known a little bit after Lessing, pantheism, right? So pan as in everything, theism. So the belief that there is essentially no God for Spinoza, or the belief that everything is God for Spinoza. And these are two very different sort of tracks of interpretation. And I want us to try to really focus on understanding the motivations for both of them, because I think that they both have some pretty solid philosophical reasons for interpreting Spinoza the way that they do. So let's first just talk about who these guys are, right? Bayle and Lessing. These are two figures that I would say are not commonly taught in philosophy departments. They're like a couple of these figures that I think have sort of been forgotten as, you know, time moves on and, you know, you have more and more history to cover and less time to do it, right? These figures, I think, at some point got the cut, right? Bayle was a very interesting figure. He was like kind of similar to Pascal or Montaigne. He was like a skeptical Christian. So his whole thing was that, like, you know, you can make all of these rational arguments against Christianity, but that they're ultimately useless against faith. That faith is more powerful than reason. And so the fact that we cannot know things about God should only lead us to be faithful rather than lead us into a kind of disbelief or something like that. And so Bale was, very often dissatisfied with philosophical systems because he felt that they led to absurdity. That, you're essentially kind of trying to take up the position of God and understand the universe in that way. And that's pretty explicitly the task for figures like Spinoza. But you end up saying absurd, crazy stuff, right? He points out, for example, in the case of Descartes, like Descartes gives a very nice, for theological reasons, conception of the soul as only belonging to rational things and being the same as the mind. But then he's forced to deny that animals have minds. And he's forced to say all of these absurd things to defend his philosophical system. And so Bale was very angry at people like Spinoza. For him, he felt like people like Spinoza led people to atheism. Because what people like Spinoza did is they tried way too hard to reason about God, right? And ultimately all they did was give fodder to atheists, right? When you say all this absurd stuff about God, people think that God is like impossible or something. And so Bale was very self-righteously, like extremely angry with Spinoza and decried Spinoza's atheism, right? And then at the same time, he's also kind of trying to say, in my skeptical attitude is more appropriate than the rationalists. Funny story, Bale himself was called an atheist, and Bale himself went through his own atheism controversy in his life, even though he was like, sicking the dogs on somebody else, essentially. And Lessing, Bale was a French philosopher, by the way, and Lessing was a German philosopher. He was kind of a figure of the German Enlightenment. He actually wasn't a professor or anything like that. He was a librarian. But what he did that sort of made him very famous is that he was involved in the publication of a lot of material from this library and sort of giving it access to the greater German public. And so he's considered sort of, an important Enlightenment figure. He also wrote like plays and stuff like that on the importance of toleration, especially about religious beliefs. And so he's very much, kind of in that Enlightenment, free-thinking sort of tradition. One of the biggest controversies of his life is that he published like a pamphlet from an atheist. And so he had his own atheism controversy. And actually, after he was dead, another guy named Jacobi claimed that Lessing told him that he was a Spinozist at the end of his life, which was shocking for the public. Why was it shocking? Well, because what what Lessing's religious detractors said about him was that he was a secret atheist. That he, sort of professed all this nonsense about toleration and whatever because he doesn't really believe in God. And so, to confess at the end of your life that you're a Spinozist, right, ultimately amounts to confessing that you're an atheist, right? And therefore confessing also that all of this Enlightenment stuff that you've been feeding people for the last 50 years is a crock of shit, and that, really it's all to kind of like introduce atheism to people, introduce non-belief. So, looking at this, it's kind of funny because everyone involved had an atheism dispute, and for everyone involved, it was kind of related to Spinoza. It was also related especially to the Spinoza's idea that whatever is in God, right? So let's talk about why that's a huge problem for Baal first. Baal was extremely well regarded at the time, right? He tends not to get as much, I don't know, love anymore. I think I mentioned previously that part of the reason is because he wrote in this weird kind of dictionary, encyclopedia type format that, he was kind of just replaced by a more accurate, newer edition, encyclopedia, and then kind of forgotten. But he's a very interesting figure, and a lot of the philosophers at the time, especially the next philosopher that we're going to discuss, Leibniz, were in very deep conversations with him. So, if you're ever interested, these are, I would say, some deep cuts, so that's cool. Anyway. So Baal, why is Baal convinced that this proposition makes Spinoza an atheist? I mean, it seems obvious that Spinoza is saying, hey, ding, 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 whatever it is in God, right? So don't I very clearly believe in God? That's kind of what the obvious Spinoza's defense is. And Baal says, your conception of God, Spinoza, is absurd. It makes no sense. It has no connection to the traditional religious conception of God. And so you can use the word God all you would like, but you are nonetheless an atheist. Your conception of God is indistinguishable from matter. And so, a lot of these religious thinkers tended to think about Spinoza as a materialist, even though he did not explicitly use that terminology or really talk about matter at all. He talked about God being nature, and these thinkers are like, well, nature is made of matter. If God is the same thing as nature, then God is the same thing as matter. And in the same way that God supposedly, everything's in God, right? Just as everything material is within matter, right? That's the kind of general idea. And so for them, Spinoza is sneaking in this secular, modern conception of reality, right? Where it's like indifferent matter, bumping up against one another. Spinoza's sneaking all of that in to a supposedly theological conception. But for them, it has nothing to do with, existing religious practice at all. And in fact, is extremely antithetical to it. So let's get into some of his reasons. Well, Baal says, if Spinoza's picture is true, then God is responsible for weakness, cruelty, evil, and absurdity. So let's go through those one by one. So God is meant to be omnipotence, right? God is meant to have all perfections, all powers. And yet, right, I am nothing but God, right? It's not like I'm part of some other substance. No, whatever is in God. So I am in God, right? But I exhibit all of these vices. I'm weak, I'm cruel, I can be evil or absurd, right? I can sin, right? That's sort of Baal's Christianized conception in the background here. And so, while the religious conception of God exhibits all perfections, for Spinoza, God just is everything. And in virtue of being everything, is all of this imperfect crap, right? We can't think about God as limitless if God is just the same as me and I'm weak, right? We can't think about God as all good if God is just me and I'm cruel or evil. And we can't think about God as all-knowing if I'm just God and I don't know everything, right? And so Spinoza attributes all of these features of finite things to God. And so, you know, Bayle's kind of idea is, well, this Cartesian notion of substance as independence, that has nothing to do with religious practice or belief, right? And that is really what's going on here, is that Descartes developed a conception of substance that was built for, that was appropriate for the development of modern science, right? Because he wanted to use substance and mode and attributes, etc., to be able to describe physical interactions, to be able to describe how bodies transfer motion onto one another, and so on. It was a scientific framework. But Descartes just kind of kept throwing all this religious stuff into it, you know, to appease, you know, the Vatican or whoever, right? Okay, yeah, you know, everything all in the universe happens through matter and motion, but God started all the matter, right? Stuff like that. For Bayle, that's so dissatisfying, right? That doesn't work from the religious perspective because you've now moved way too far away from what they're trying to do. And it doesn't really work in a scientific perspective because now you're incorporating all this religious crap into there too. And now that doesn't work either, right? And so Bayle thinks that Spinoza is this sort of outgrowth of this modern Cartesian approach, this rationalism that leads you to crazy, absurd beliefs about God. Another one is that God contradicts himself, right? So like, insofar as I'm an expression of God and I think broccoli is disgusting and my wife is an expression of God and she thinks broccoli is delicious, then God both thinks that broccoli is disgusting and delicious. Right? And Bayle is trying to say, and for those of you that take this for your midterm, these are the kind of arguments he makes. Come on, this is absurd, right? Because Spinoza got rid of the category of finite substance, we don't have the ability to differentiate my beliefs from your beliefs or anybody else's, right? Whatever is in God. And so all of these contradictory beliefs are also in God. And then, sort of the most offensive part of all of this, and I've written this in kind of a funny way, the paper of the Bible expresses God as well as the text. What do I mean by that? Well, all modes are an expression of God. Insofar as the Bible expresses God, or the Torah expresses God, they express God as well as the paper does, as well as this mouse does, as well as any other mode. Right? It's not like it has any, it's not like God actually gave revelations or anything like that. God doesn't do that. God's not a person on Spinoza's view. And so religious texts, they're like at best kind of cultural artifacts. That's it. Right? And so Bayle's pissed. Bayle's like, well, you know, you claim to be religious. The Bible means nothing to you. God contradicts himself. God is weak and cruel and evil and absurd in your view. And there's no way that anyone could ever believe in that kind of God for any sort of religious purpose. There's no like absolution. There's no afterlife. There's no, you know, God as being like a judge. There's none of that stuff, right? None of the stuff that would give us a satisfying religious conception of God. And that's why Bayle is convinced that Spinoza is a clandestine, so secret atheist. Now, to go to the other side, I love this blessing text that we read. I think it is so cool. I think that it gets through so much philosophy in 2 pages. And this text is what really convinced me more than anything else. We all need to read more Lessing. He's a very interesting guy. He was actually influenced a lot by the philosopher we're going to read next, Leibniz, but he was kind of always stuck between Leibniz and Spinoza. Because he was like he, like Bale, was sort of this Enlightenment figure that was a Christian, but also struggled with his Christianity. He was very attracted to a Christian conception of God, which is what Leibniz, our next philosopher, is going to try to give us. But he was also very, very shaken by the arguments given in the Ethics, and he felt, that they attacked many core Christian beliefs. And so let's get into some quotes here. So Lessing, rather than saying that Spinoza is an atheist and saying that there is no God, is that he is a pantheist, that everything is God. And Lessing wants to say this is importantly distinct from atheism. It may be that, you don't like it, Bale, okay, whatever. I don't care about that. It is, at least theoretically, still very, very different from atheism. And so Lessing starts out his piece with this. He said, however I try to explain the reality of things outside of God, I have to confess that I can form no conception of it. And so the idea here is that, like, once you get started on this Cartesian idea of substance, of absolute substance, then this pantheistic problem is always going to come back. Because then everything is in God. Everything is in some way dependent on God as, the absolute substance. And so you sort of unconsciously start moving towards the Spinozistic worldview. And there was a fear, that Spinoza's rationalist system actually was the most consistent, right? And what that meant to the religious thinkers of the time is not, we need a new, better, rationalistic metaphysical system. Instead, they want to put the hammer down on the whole enterprise of doing philosophy, right? It becomes like, that you're always sort of generating these clandestine atheists that are a threat to existing religious beliefs. And so Lessing, in this first quote, sort of admits with Spinoza that, like, yeah, maybe I want to be a good Christian like Bale, but it's actually impossible for me to conceive of God in any way except how Spinoza does it, right? And why is that? Because if there were things outside of God, then God would not be the cause of them, would have no knowledge of them, they would not be dependent on God. But that goes against the conception of God as omnipotent or as substance, right? And Lessing tries to say, well, if I think about something that's like a mode that's not contained in a substance, or if I try to think about two substances, as Spinoza talks about at the beginning of the Ethics, then I have to confess I can form no conception of it, right? What could we even be talking about? For there to be a reality outside of God, it would have to be something in which God has no conception, which God is somehow unrelated to, which is an absurdity given this picture of God. And so Lessing's kind of arguing, well, Bale, even your conception of Christianity inevitably tends towards this Spinozistic view and all of its religious controversies. And at one point, he sort of considers the objections that Bale gives to this interpretation. Oh, well, then all these evil and contingent things in the universe would also be in God. And that It's to violate our conception of God. And Lessing's response is, and so what? So what? There's contingency now inside of God, so what? All of the things that we think about as being contingent, as being modes, all this evil stuff, right, that we didn't want to think about as being contained in God, is contained in God. So what? And so, right? And so what? So what? Contingency inside of God. It seems like something that we have to accept and we have to say is real, right? And this goes very, very much against existing religious beliefs at the time, which held that everything about God is necessary. All the things that are contingent, that's all the created stuff, that's all the evil shit, all the finite stuff, that has nothing to do with God. Instead, Spinoza's picture puts all of that stuff right at the heart of God itself. Contingency, evil, suffering, all stem directly from God. And Lessing, as an Enlightenment thinker, his response to the arguments of Lessing, fundamentally, more than anything else, is when he says, and so? So what? Yes, it's true. But there's no way that we can avoid that conclusion. God is everything, and so God is the principal source of evil, suffering, injustice, false belief, and so on. And there's no other way that we can conceive of God than this. Okay, hopefully you can see why people were very, very wrapped up in these debates and why it was such, political firecracker at the time. This will also help us a ton next week with beginning to understand Leibniz, because he's a philosopher who really tries to develop a Christian system of reason, right? A Christian metaphysics of the kind that we see in Descartes. So against this Spinozistic sort of picture. He wants to restore these Christian conceptions of God, like the fact that God is a person, and God is a judge, and God is a lawbringer. He wants to bring that back into the essence of God, but also to give a rational account of it that is not based in prejudice and superstition. So, I hope that you will find that all interesting. I look forward to hearing what you think. I hope that you've enjoyed our time with Spinoza. I know that I have. Okay, have a nice week. Bye.